Hello and welcome to your lecture on language and oral style. This screencast will walk you through some different elements of your textbook on how to word your presentations and everyday speech effectively. And we'll talk about some of the different components of language, some of the different things that we like to use in everyday and formal presenting to ensure that our message gets across the most effectively. Now, you've probably noticed by now, if you're in one of my online classes, that we're jumping around in the textbook and we're not necessarily going around it in order. And that's simply because textbooks are not necessarily written in the order that the content needs to be taught. There are certain things you need to know before you can progress to others. So if you're flipping around wildly, just make sure that the title of this one matches up with the title of whatever you're following along in your textbook. So, to kind of get into our discussion for the day, oral language style is essentially how we choose to speak. Every single one of us have our own style, and one of the rules of thumb that we do want to hold on to would be that we need to be brief and familiar. So, don't stretch something out any longer than it needs to be, which is very difficult if you're like me. I'm a very wordy person, as you have undoubtedly noticed by now. So, being brief and direct and to the point can be a bit of a difficulty for some of us if we're just not naturally designed that way. So, if you're wordy, like me, you have to learn to shorten it up as much as you can. As an instructor, it's my job to be able to teach something to you 3 to 5 different ways. So, instead of just saying, hi, be brief, that means short, peace out, and moving on, I do have to sit on a topic a little bit longer to make sure I've explained it enough different ways in order for everyone to be able to latch on and connect to that content. However, when you are a presenter or in a conversation, you might only have one shot to get that information across. So you want it to be as brief as possible and to use language that is familiar to your listening audience. This means while you might want to incorporate some new vocabulary to expand their learning, knowledge, and understanding, you do largely want to use wording, terminology, and phrasing that your audience already knows so you don't leave them behind. In argumentation and debate class, there's a whole section for each type of debate where you define your terms to make sure that everybody understands what you're talking about before you get into the actual argument, which I think is an excellent tactic. Secondly, whenever you want to improve your oral language style, something you want to do is use we speak. And we speak is when you use plural personal pronouns like we, us, and ours. It creates a community, a culture of community in your language. Instead of saying you, or me, it's a we, which is you'll hear sometimes in my presentations or my lectures where I will say when we write an introduction to a speech, even though you are the ones who are doing the work for the course that you're in right now, of course, I have to follow those same rules whenever I'm designing a presentation formally as well. So technically, I am in that boat with you. So using we speak creates something known as immediacy, and I will cover what immediacy is in just a little bit. As best you can, try to be descriptive. You don't want just to say something like, this is a good thing. Good could be defined probably 100 different ways. If I created a poll right now for all of you all to answer in the midst of this lecture and asked you to open-ended answer me what you think good means, we would probably get 20 to 25 different answers because that's how many people are in the class. And if I use the word thing, it's the same rule there. What does thing mean to you? So when you're being descriptive, this means that you want to give something an adequate amount of information. You want us to be able to see it, hear it, taste it, understand it, while being brief and familiar. For example, when I was about 12 years old, my favorite word in the world was gargantuan, which means really, really big. And so I love to use gargantuan all the time in conversation, and sometimes people understood what it meant and they got my point of view, and other times they didn't. My favorite word now, just in case you're interested, is recalcitrant, which means stubbornly resistant to guidance or authority, which is me. Lastly, you do want to make sure that your oral language style is organized. You need to make sense. You need to know where you're going. So, if it takes you a couple of minutes to sit back and think for a moment or two before you speak, if you take that information from chapter 1, where we talked about encoding, how speakers have to encode before they send out their message through the channel, then being organized is a good way to prompt that encoding filter in your mind. The next thing that language should be would be appropriate. You're going to see a lot of different categories, and then you're going to see terminology associated with those categories. Now, when language is appropriate, they have that first term that I've already mentioned once today, which is immediacy. And immediacy is when you essentially create a culture of unity or comfort with your audience. It's immediate, which means close. So, immediacy is when you kind of build that closeness with your audience. They feel a connection with you, they understand who you are and where you're trying to go, and therefore they're going to be more engaged to listen to you actively and be a part of that particular moment. As a speaker, one of the ways that you can create immediacy, I have mentioned already, is using We Speak. It's creating that community and bridging that gap between speaker and audience. Other ways that you can create immediacy would be to be a balance of formal and informal. So, formal is when it's perfect language, perfect posture, perfect vocabulary, perfect intonation that is professional the entire time and never varies, and you're probably wearing a business suit. Informal is something a little bit more with slang, relaxed language, and is very, very familiar. And what you want to have as a presenter is a mix of the two. You want to be familiar enough for people to feel immediacy with you, but you need to be formal enough to sound like you are the professional in the room who knows what they're doing. The next thing you want to do is have relevant information. Whatever you're talking about and whoever you might be needs to be relevant to the situation. If you and your group are in there talking about Doritos, and someone jumps in and wants to talk about climate change, that's not necessarily relevant to the conversation. While it's still important, it's not relevant in that moment. So, whether this is day to day conversation or whether this is a formal presentation, whatever you bring up needs to be something that is relevant to what's going on now. Your language also needs to be sensitive or inclusive. Inclusive means that you are aware of and recognize the different cultures and lifestyles in your language. One of the easiest examples I can provide you for this one is the very popular use of the phrase, you guys. Now, everyone that I know has used that phrase, you guys, and there's not anything technically wrong with it. But are you only referring to an audience of males and people that identify as male? Probably not. There's probably a lot of gals in that particular relationship, or you might have people that also identify as non binary. So, if you're going to use you guys, you need to make sure that you are speaking in front of an audience that is all of guys and who do not mind being referred to that way. Otherwise, you're probably going to have to use a good old Southern you all. Of course, around here we would say y'all or you'ns if we're going to be very informal. But inclusive language is when it is a little bit more broad to include all the groups as opposed to targeting one or two. Now, I understand that in listening to this, a lot of you are probably going, wow, that's a little bit extreme. And in certain circumstances, it might be. If you're hanging out with your friends and you know them and you're very familiar and comfortable with them, the language that you choose to use can be relevant to that particular situation. But if you are presenting formally or speaking around people that you do not know, it is always a wise decision to be more inclusive until you have that familiarity and boundaries built. Lastly, you want to make sure that your communication is culturally diverse and that you are aware that there are cultural diversities in how people are raised to communicate. I should say, I was cultured to be very vocal because previous generations of females had been very much cultured to be silent and quiet in the background. So I was particularly cultured to open up your mouth and say stuff whenever you want to. So whenever I grew up, I have no problem interrupting people and making sure my voice is heard, and that's my culture and where I'm from. However, there are a lot of communication instances where interrupting people would be considered exceptionally rude, and I have to be aware of that and be very, very cognizant of the fact that interrupting is rude for a lot of people. Therefore, I have to moderate my willingness to speak up. So, that's just a small example of how we need to be aware of being culturally diverse as we go through different pieces of information. Now, of course, cultural diversity could also refer to race and ethnicity. Different countries and cultures cultures and way that you've been brought up. So that could also be a different example you could bring in. I tend to teach a lot, or in the past, I have taught a lot of international students. And one of my favorite classes I ever taught had absolutely no American students in it. I was the only Caucasian American in the room. And I had students from Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Liberia, Ireland, Sweden, China, and there's one more country in there somewhere, France, I think. It was one of the most fun classes I've ever taught because nobody knew anything about anybody else's culture. So we had a wonderful time sharing about the different rules that we have in communication. It was probably one of the best experiences teaching I've ever had because it gave me an experience in cultural diversity. If you haven't sought out opportunities to experience different cultures, I recommend that you look into that just because it will broaden your horizons as a person and be very useful to you in the future whenever you are doing speaking engagements. So, next we have accuracy. Your language and oral style should be very accurate. And a few things we have to keep in mind is that language is arbitrary. And when language is arbitrary, that essentially means they can be defined in different ways. There aren't necessarily set rules for how language is going to communicate certain definitions. So for me, there's not, as your textbook says, there's not exactly a literal connection between a word and the word's meaning. You and I could have the same word and define it very differently. For example, the word good that I mentioned earlier, we could each define that differently. So it has a very arbitrary meaning. Along with that, language is going to be abstract, which means there are going to be some concepts that are exceptionally difficult or soft or vague or kind of blurry whenever you try to define them. Think of a word like love. I know we might go chuckle, 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 what on earth? But think about it for a second. You can pause me and shut me up for a minute and try to define love. Good luck, okay? What does it feel like? What does it taste like? How do we define this? In what way? For whom? For family, friends, romantic intimacy? There's so many different definitions there for love. So arbitrary kind of means there's not going to be a literal meaning for a word, and abstract means that some elements of language are exceptionally difficult to define. When something's concrete, like hard concrete, it means you can have a literal definition. Like if I say three, you know that means one, two, and three. If I say something like love, it's kind of like, what do you mean by that? Last thing, in order to be accurate with your language, is to be very aware that language is changeable. It does change over time. It will always change over time. That's just how communication goes. And that's one of the best things in my mind about communication is the fact that it is different. I'm a very changeable person. I love teaching simply because everything about it changes all the time. And if I had to do the same thing every day for the rest of my life, I would probably lose my mind. So teaching is wonderful because it is so changeable. You might be comfortable without change, and that's fine. I'm just saying, be aware communication does change over time. For example, 30 years ago, the phrase you guys would not have raised any eyebrows. But nowadays, you guys is now an exclusive phrase instead of an inclusive one. So to move on, there are just a couple of terms you need to know before I move on any further. The denotative or denotation meaning of a word means the dictionary or literally defined meaning of a word. So if I ask you for a word's denotation, I'm pretty much asking you to pull up a glossary or a dictionary and give me or Google it and tell me the exact definition of something. The connotation of a word is more the emotionally abstract meaning that we bring to a word that might not necessarily line up with the dictionary meaning so much. An example of that could be something like the word dog. The literal dictionary definition of the word dog is probably going to define it as some type of four-legged furry canine. And the connotation of a word, if I say you dog, well, I'm calling you a name now and I'm defining you as something. And I could be very serious and ugly with that term, or I could be humorous and picking on you, and it means something different. So, denotation, think of the first letter there being a D. Denotation is the dictionary meaning. Connotation is an abstract emotional meaning that typically changes person to person. The last thing I really want you to know for the key terms would be the dialect. And according to your textbook, it's essentially a unique form of language that different people might use. And the dialect typically comes from how you've been cultured to understand what a word means. So there might be some phrasing and vocabulary in your culture, for example, Southern culture, that is different from someone, for example, Midwestern or Northern culture. For example, around here, we generally call it soda. If I say soda, you know that I'm talking about a sweetened carbonated beverage and not like soda powder. But if you're up in certain northern areas, they call it pop or soda pop. And generally, in a lot of Midwestern areas, it's just called Coke. Even though, of course, there's like 50 to 100 different soda varieties out there, if they say Coke, they mean a soda. So that's an emphasis on how dialect can change our information. Now, the next thing we want our language to be would be clear, and the easiest way to have clear language is to be as specific as possible and stay on target with what you're discussing. So please be as specific as you possibly can be. This means that you use precise language to describe something, and again, brief, familiar, specific language. I've already mentioned being familiar, so I'm not going to, go over that again, but I will mention two subpoints here about jargon and slang. And jargon is essentially professional terminology, like someone outside of your field would not know what that means. One of my best friends is a huge car guy. He describes himself as a car guy, so I have permission to call him that. And he was talking to me the other day about turbo flutter. And while I have spent a significant part of my life around car people, I have not necessarily learned anything about cars. My knowledge of cars is basically that one's loud and that one's pretty, that one drifts really well. So I had to ask him what turbo flutter was. Anyone in the car business would understand turbo flutter, so that's jargon because it's business language. So, as much as you can, if you're giving a professional presentation or trying to explain something to someone, avoid professional business language that's specific to that area unless that person's in that business with you. So, if you were sitting here trying to tell me what's wrong with my car and you're using technical mechanic terminology, I will not be able to understand you. Therefore, you have been unclear. It is your job to use language that communicates to me in that context. The other thing I want you to avoid is slang. And this is informal language, and we all know what slang is. It's when we use some type of vocabulary that's not exactly standard, and generally your social group or age group is what has determined what slang is. For example, about 5 years ago, savage was the word for everything. Recently, we've been having hamming out of something or yeeting right along. There was that little YOLO phase there for a while. That's all slang. It's just generally socially constructed meaning that has its wonderful little moment and then goes away. And generally, by the time some of us have learned what it is, it's already out of fashion. As much as you can be, please do be detailed. We want to make sure that we understand an adequate amount of information about whatever it is you're discussing. So be specific. You need to use familiar language that the average person has access to, and it needs to be detailed enough to make sense without it being overly long. So, as much as you can, try to limit pauses and verbal disfluencies. Now, pauses are necessary. You do need to breathe. Drawing breath is very important. So, there's no problem there. Take a breath when you need to. But it does mean that whenever you're not having lengthy pauses in between phrases, because we'll notice your pauses more than we'll notice your words at that point. So, you can build pauses in for emphasis, but if you have a habit of pausing a lot, you need to train that out. Verbal disfluencies are using words such as like, as, so. We all have patterns. You've clearly heard a couple of my patterns. They're not as heavy as they could be. Please be very aware of verbal disfluencies because they can get out of hand very quickly. I think I had a student use the word like 117 times in a 3-minute speech once, and as you can tell, I counted the likes more than I did pay attention to what she was saying. Last topic of the day is vivid language. So, vivid language is essentially when you bring your language to life and we feel it, we sense it, we understand it, we are in that moment with you. So, this and the next slide are going to introduce you to some tactics that you can use to really bump up the vividity of your particular presentation. One is using sensory language, and this means you use language that describes the five senses to us. Describe how something tastes. Don't just say it tastes good. You can use words like salty, sweet, vibrant, powerful, pungent, whatever it is, strong language to make us understand how it feels, is give us those senses. Use similes. Similes are phrases that use the word like or as. If I could say, this tastes like this, that's a simile. A metaphor is a type of comparison generally between unlike items. The example your textbook uses would be that car is a lemon. So you're essentially doing a comparison similar to a simile, but you don't use the word like or as. So, same thing, it's a comparison, but it has different languages. The next thing that you can do would be to use personification. And personification is when you give something that is not alive or not sentient and you give it person's characteristics. Like if I say that's a really recalcitrant shoe, remember earlier I said that's stubbornly resistant to guidance or authority? I'm essentially saying I'm having a really difficult time getting this shoe on or off my foot. But I've personified or given this unalive item a personality. I've given it a trait. Onomatopoeia is another thing that you can do. I absolutely adore that word. Onomatopoeia is whenever there's a word that describes a sound. So it's words that have come from sounds. Let's think of the word like hiss. The word hiss did not exist before a cat or something else hissed, and in an attempt to describe that sound, they gave it a word. So instead of just saying the pot, they said the pot hissed. And instead of saying the bee bzzz, they said the bee buzzed. So onomatopoeia is whenever you've given a sound a word. So you could say something like the lid just popped. And I'm using the word pop, but it's clearly the name of a sound. It's really kind of fun to play with. Lastly, you can use repetition. The more that you repeat yourself effectively, the longer, I should say, the longer the information will stay with your audience's mind. You'll hear me referring back to previous lectures and previous items in this lecture multiple times, like I introduced immediacy before I talked about it, and then I referred back to immediacy again, and I've talked about familiarity probably about 4 or 5 times in this lecture. I didn't make it really obvious, hey, I'm talking about familiarity again. I just incorporated it into the flow so that you have another chance to scoop up that learning that I'm trying to emphasize on that particular point. So, repetition is something you can build into your speaking without making it too obvious, where your audience gets another chance to understand that particular concept. So here's a token opportunity. This token opportunity is not in your syllabus. I'm going to hide them in lectures every now and then just so I can sneakily see who is watching these lectures and watching them to the end. And of course, if you don't want to do it, you don't have to. But if you're in one of my courses, there is a certain item called a token. If you're not in one of my courses, you cannot listen to me at this point because this doesn't refer to you. So, a token opportunity for what I want you to do is I want you to try to take any everyday basic object and then find ways to describe that object using the 6 vividity or vivid tools that I just put in your toolbox in the previous 2 slides. I introduced you to 6 different ways that you all can bulk up and boost your language. So, I want you to find something really simple like a basketball or a Clorox wipe or a mask if we want to be really relevant to the time this lecture was recorded, and use those different vivid language tips and just write a sentence per, maybe 2 sentences per, and really just describe that in 6 different ways just to get your brain wrapped around the different ways that you can boost your vivid language. Email that document to me by following the appropriate rules of email communication, and you will earn yourself a token. Thank you so much for watching and listening. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day.